The relentless midday sun of the Nevada Territory did not offer a warm welcome. Instead, it seemed intent on scorching the very hope out of the air. May Lynn stood in the shadow of the mercantile's overhang, the only sanctuary she could find in the dusty, sprawling settlement that felt less like a town and more like a collection of buildings huddled together for survival against the desert. She smoothed the skirt of her light blue prairie dress, a garment that felt terribly out of place amidst the browns, grays, and faded tans of the frontier. The fabric was too crisp, the color too reminiscent of a spring sky, while everything around her was the color of dried earth. She was 22 years old, and she felt every mile of the journey that had brought her from the coast to this desolate inland expanse. In her hand she clutched a crumpled letter, the paper damp from the moisture of her palm. It was her only link to a man she had never met, a man named Samuel. The marriage broker had been blunt, almost apologetic when describing him. He was a man of few means, the broker had said, a rancher struggling to keep a foothold in a territory that chewed up the weak. May Lynn had accepted this fate with a quiet resignation. She had not come to America expecting a palace. She had come expecting survival. Poverty was a language she understood. She knew how to stretch a sack of rice, how to mend fabric until the thread was more prominent than the cloth, and how to find warmth in a cold room. She had prepared herself to be the wife of a poor man, to work her fingers to the bone alongside him. Standing there, watching the heat waves ripple off the packed dirt of the main street, she steeled herself. She would be a good wife. She would not complain. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the gnawing worm of anxiety in her stomach began to turn. The town was loud, filled with the coarse shouts of miners and the heavy rattle of supply wagons. Yet she felt enveloped in a profound, isolating silence. She watched every man who walked by, wondering if he was the one. Was it the tall, angry-looking man with the scar? Was it the older, hunched prospector leading a mule? Every time a stranger's eyes brushed past her, her heart hammered against her ribs. She felt exposed, a splash of blue paint on a muddy canvas. The broker had told her Samuel was shy, a man who kept to himself. That terrified her more than a cruel man might have. Cruelty was visible. Silence was a deep water that could hide anything. She shifted her weight, her boots, sturdy, practical things she had bought with her last coin, feeling heavy and foreign. She looked down at the wooden boardwalk, trying to compose her face into a mask of serene patience. She could not let them see her fear. She could not let this unknown husband see that she was already terrified of the life that awaited her. Then the sound of hoofbeats slowed and stopped just a few yards away. The rhythm was different from the frantic pace of the other riders. It was deliberate, careful. May Lynn looked up slowly, shielding her eyes against the glare. A man was dismounting from a large chestnut-colored horse. He was not the giant she had feared, nor the withered old man she had dreaded. He was of average height, perhaps a little taller, with broad shoulders that seemed to carry an invisible weight. His clothes were worn, a dusty vest over a faded shirt that had been mended at the elbow, and trousers that had seen many seasons of hard labor. His hat was pulled low, shading his face, but as he turned toward the mercantile she saw his profile. He looked tired. He looked like the poverty she had been promised. He tied the horse to the rail with gentle, practiced movements, patting the animal's neck with a tenderness that caught her off guard. Then he turned and looked at her. The air between them seemed to still, the noise of the town fading into a dull roar in the background. He froze, his hand still resting on the hitching post. He seemed startled by her, as if he hadn't truly believed she would be there, or perhaps as if the reality of her, the blue dress, the dark hair, the stillness, was too much for him to process. He took a hesitant step forward, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of wheat, flattened by the brim. His face was sunburned and dusted with the grit of the trail, but his eyes were a startling, clear gray. They were the eyes of a man who spent a lot of time looking at the horizon. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. He just looked at her with a mixture of awe and profound apology. Maylin clutched the letter tighter. This was him. This was Samuel. The man with nothing, who had asked for a wife because he had no one else to share his struggle. Miss Maylin? His voice was raspy, as if he hadn't used it in days. It was a quiet voice, low and rumbling, almost lost under the noise of a passing cart. He stopped 5 feet away from her, maintaining a respectful distance that felt like a chasm. He looked down at his boots, then back up at her, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. He seemed painfully aware of the dust on his clothes and the contrast it held against her clean attire. "I'm Samuel. I hope you haven't been waiting long in this heat." The apology came first, just as she had expected from a man beaten down by life. He fumbled with the brim of his hat, his fingers rough and calloused, stained with the earth he worked. Maylin stepped forward, lowering her hand from her eyes. She offered him a small, practiced bow of her head, a gesture of respect she had been taught was proper. "I have not waited long," she lied softly. Her English was accented but clear, the result of months of study during her journey. "It is good to meet you, Mr. Samuel." She looked at him, trying to find the hard edge of a master, but she found only a nervous tremors in his hands. He looked at the mercantile window, then at the horse, then back to her, seemingly at a loss for what to do next. The awkwardness was palpable, a physical weight that pressed down on them both. He looked like a man who wanted to run away, not from her, but from the situation, from the embarrassment of his own presence. "I have to tell you something," Samuel said, his voice gaining a little strength, though his eyes darted away again. "Something about the transport." He gestured vaguely toward the street. Maylin looked past him, expecting to see a wagon, perhaps a rickety cart pulled by a mule, something suitable for a poor farmer to transport his new bride and her singular trunk of belongings. But the street behind him was empty of such things. There was only the chestnut horse he had arrived on, and another horse, a smaller, spotted mare tied further down the rail that she hadn't noticed before. The mare was saddled, but there was no carriage, no wagon, no shelter from the sun. "The buckboard," Samuel started, then stopped, rubbing the back of his neck. It's not here. The wheel is gone. I couldn't fix it in time. I didn't have the parts." He looked miserable as he admitted this failure. "I know it's not proper. I know you expected a carriage, but we have to ride. It's the only way to get back before sundown." He pointed to the spotted mare. "I brought her for you. She's gentle, old, but gentle." He looked at her with a terrified expression, as if he expected her to scream or to turn around and walk back into the mercantile and refuse to go with him. "I can carry your trunk on my saddle, but we have to ride." Maylin stared at the horse. She had never ridden a horse in her life. In the city she came from, horses were for the wealthy or the military, or they were beasts of burden pulling carts. One did not sit upon them. The animal looked enormous from where she stood, a beast of muscle and unpredictable energy. Fear spiked in her chest, sharp and cold. She looked at her dress, at the delicate fabric, and then at the dusty saddle. This was the first test. She knew it. If she refused, she would be useless to him. A rancher's wife who could not ride would be a burden in a place like this. She looked at Samuel's anxious face. He wasn't commanding her. He was pleading with her. He was ashamed that he couldn't provide a carriage, ashamed of his poverty that prevented him from fixing a simple wheel. I do not know how," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, shame mingling with fear. "I have never sat on a horse." Samuel blinked, seemingly surprised by this, though he shouldn't have been. "I will fall," she stated simply. Samuel's expression softened instantly. The nervousness seemed to recede slightly, replaced by a sudden protective instinct. He stepped a little closer, the distance closing. "You won't fall," he said, and for the first time his voice held a note of certainty. "I won't let you fall. We'll take it slow, step by step." He gestured toward the mare. "Her name is Bess. She's family. She'll take care of you." He paused, looking at her with a sudden intensity. "I know this isn't what you wanted. I know this is hard. But if you trust me, just for today, I'll get you home." Home. The word hung in the air. A shack, she imagined, a dirt floor. But she had made a promise. She nodded slowly. "I will try." Samuel exhaled, a long breath of relief. He moved to untie the horses, and for a moment Maylin watched his back. He moved with a grace that belied his ragged clothes. He was poor, yes. He was unprepared, yes. But he was not cruel. She walked out from the shade of the overhang and into the blinding sun, ready to climb onto the back of the beast, ready to begin the life of hardship she had traveled across an ocean to find. The physical act of mounting the horse was an indignity Maylin had not prepared for. The stirrup seemed impossibly high, and the animal shifted beneath the leather tack, letting out a huff of air that smelled of grain and warm fur. Samuel stood beside her, his presence close and smelling of sagebrush and sweat. He did not laugh at her clumsiness. Instead, he cupped his hands to form a step for her boot, his touch hesitant but firm. "Put your foot here," he instructed softly, not looking at her legs, his eyes fixed on the saddle horn as if to give her privacy in the middle of the public street. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. She pushed up, her heavy skirts tangling around her ankles, and for a moment she felt weightless before landing awkwardly in the saddle. The world swayed. She gripped the leather horn with white-knuckled desperation. From this height, the ground seemed miles away. Samuel adjusted her stirrups, his hands moving quickly and efficiently near her boots. He checked the cinch, giving it a final tug that made the mare groan. "Just hold the reins loosely," he said, looking up at her. The sun was behind her, framing her in light, and he squinted, his expression unreadable. "Don't pull back unless you want her to stop. She'll follow me. You don't have to do much but sit deep." He walked back to his own horse, the large chestnut, and swung himself up in one fluid motion that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. He tied her small trunk behind his saddle with rope, testing the knots twice. "Ready?" he asked. She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. They rode out of town at a walk. The noise of the settlement faded quickly, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of hooves on dry earth and the ceaseless high-pitched drone of cicadas. As the last buildings disappeared behind a ridge, the true scale of the landscape revealed itself to Maylin. It was terrifyingly vast. Hills rolled out in every direction, painted in shades of ochre, burnt orange, and sage green, stretching until they dissolved into purple mountains in the far distance. The sky was a crushing dome of blue, relentless and empty. There were no walls here, no boundaries. She felt small, a speck of dust that could be blown away by the wind and never missed. They rode in silence. Samuel kept his horse a few paces ahead and to the left, constantly checking over his shoulder to ensure she was still there. He didn't try to make conversation. He didn't ask her about her journey or her family or her thoughts on the weather. He simply rode, his body moving in perfect sync with his horse. Maylin watched him. He had a slouch to his shoulders that disappeared when he looked at the horizon, a vigilance that seemed ingrained. She wondered what he was thinking. Was he disappointed? Did he regret sending for a bride who couldn't even ride a horse? He had expected a partner for his work, and instead, he had to nursemaid her across the prairie. The heat grew oppressive. Sweat trickled down her back, and the corset she wore felt like a vice. Her legs began to ache from the unfamiliar position, the leather chafing through her stockings. She bit her lip, refusing to ask for a break. If this was to be her life, riding miles to check fences or cattle for a poor rancher, she had to toughen herself. She looked at Samuel's back again. His shirt was stained with sweat between the shoulder blades. He worked hard, that much was clear. The poverty the broker spoke of was likely due to the harshness of this land, not a lack of effort. She felt a pang of pity for him. He was trying to build a life in a place that seemed to want them dead. "You doing all right?" Samuel's voice floated back to her, breaking the silence. He didn't turn around this time, keeping his eyes on the trail which had narrowed as it wound through a canyon of red rock. "I am fine," she called back, forcing her voice to be steady. He slowed his horse until he was riding beside her. "We have a ways to go yet. The place is pretty far out. Land was cheaper the further out you went." He offered a small, self-deprecating smile. "I know it's hot. We'll stop at the creek up ahead." "It is beautiful," she said, surprising herself. She gestured to the red cliffs towering above them. "But very big." Samuel looked up at the rocks. "Yeah, it makes you feel small. I like that about it. Keeps you honest." He looked at her, his gray eyes softening. "I'm sorry about the wagon, Maylin. I truly am. I wanted to bring you home like a lady, not drag you through the dust like a hand." "I am not a lady," she said quietly. "I am your wife. I do not need a wagon." He looked at her for a long moment, a strange emotion crossing his face, surprise perhaps, or respect. "Well," he said, turning his gaze back to the trail, "you're doing better than most men I know on their first ride." The compliment, small as it was, warmed her more than the sun. They fell back into silence, but the tension had eased. The fear of him was fading, replaced by a shared endurance of the elements. But as the hours wore on, the physical toll mounted. Her thighs burned, and her hands were cramping from gripping the reins. She began to wonder if they would ever arrive. How far out did this man live? If the land was cheap this far out, it must be barren. She pictured a wooden shack with gaps in the walls, wind whistling through the cracks, a single pot on a stove. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the horse's movement rock her, praying she would have the strength to hide her disappointment when they finally arrived. They reached the creek Samuel had mentioned just as the sun began its long descent, casting long, bruised shadows across the canyon floor. The water was a narrow ribbon of green in a world of brown, lined with cottonwood trees that offered a blessed, cool shade. Samuel dismounted first, his boots crunching in the gravel. He didn't tie his horse. He just dropped the reins, and the animal stood still, lowering its head to graze on the sparse grass. He walked over to Bess, the mare, and reached up. "Here," he said, "let me help you down. Your legs are going to be jelly." He was right. As soon as she slid out of the saddle, her knees buckled. Samuel caught her, his hands gripping her elbows firmly to keep her upright. For a second she was pressed against his chest, the dust on his vest smelling of earth and tobacco. He held her just long enough for her to find her footing, then stepped back quickly, as if he had been burned. "Walk it off a bit," he advised, turning away to hide his face. "It gets the blood moving." Maylin walked in small circles, the pins and needles in her legs agonizing. She watched Samuel attend to the horses. He loosened the cinches to let them breathe and led them to the water. Then he retrieved a canteen and a small leather pouch from his saddlebags. He walked over to where she had sat down on a flat rock near the water's edge. "Water," he said, handing her the canteen. It was wrapped in felt and soaked in water to keep the contents cool. She drank greedily, the water sweet and cold. He watched her, then sat down on the ground a few feet away, opening the pouch. "I brought some food. It's not much." He pulled out a wrapped bundle. Inside was cheese, a hard biscuit, and a dried sausage. He took a small folding knife from his pocket to slice the cheese. Maylin watched his hands. They were large, the skin roughened by work, with scars mapping the history of his labor. But the knife he used caught her eye. It wasn't a rusty piece of iron. The handle was bone, smooth and polished, and the blade gleamed with a sharpness that spoke of meticulous care. It was a fine tool, perhaps the only valuable thing he owned. He sliced the cheese thinly and offered it to her on the blade tip, handling it like a precious commodity. "Thank you," she said, taking the cheese. It was sharp and rich, far better than the dry rations she had expected. "I didn't have time to cook," he apologized again. He seemed to apologize for everything. "When we get home, I have a stew started. Well, it's mostly just beans." He looked at the creek. "You must be wondering why I brought you out here." "You needed a wife," she said simply. "I needed—" He paused, struggling with the words. "I have a lot of land. It's quiet. A man goes crazy with the quiet sometimes. I didn't want a servant. I wanted someone to see the sunsets with." He looked at her, his face open and vulnerable. "I know I don't have much to offer, just the land and the work. But I promise you, Maylin, you won't go hungry, and you'll be safe." Maylin looked at the sausage and cheese in her lap. "This is good food," she said. "I am content." He smiled then, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. It changed his face completely, making him look younger, less burdened. "I'm glad." He put the knife away. "We should move. We have about an hour of light left. I want to get to the shelter before dark." "The shelter?" she asked. "The house," he corrected quickly, standing up and brushing the dirt from his trousers. "My place." He helped her up again, his touch more confident this time. As she mounted the horse, she felt a shift in her own heart. He was a good man. Poor, shy, and awkward, but good. She could live with good. She could build a life on good. The sun was a sliver of fire on the western horizon when they finally crested a steep ridge. The sky was a bruising mix of violet and indigo. Samuel pulled his horse up and pointed downward. "There," he said. "That's it." Maylin followed his gaze. In the twilight she saw a small valley, and there, sitting alone in the vast emptiness, was a structure. It was small, tiny, in fact. A rough-hewn wooden cabin, barely larger than a single room, with a leaning chimney and a roof that looked patched with sod. A small corral sat to the side, empty. There were no other buildings, no barn, no bunkhouse, just the solitary, crumbling shack. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She had expected poverty, yes, but this was desolation. The walls looked like they let the wind through. It looked abandoned. This was where they would live? This was the ranch? She felt a sting of tears in her eyes and quickly blinked them away. She gripped the saddle horn. She would not cry. She would not let him see. "It's," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "It is very private." Samuel was watching her closely, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He didn't move toward the cabin. He just sat on his horse, looking at her, looking at the shack. He seemed to be waiting for something. A complaint? A demand to go back? "It's the line shack," he said, his voice unreadable. "It's where I stay when I'm working this side of the range. It's got a roof and a stove." "It is fine," she said, lifting her chin. She forced herself to look at him. "It is our home. I will make it warm." Samuel didn't speak for a long moment. He stared at her, his eyes searching her face in the dying light. He seemed to be looking for a crack in her resolve, a sign of the disgust he surely expected. When he didn't find it, he let out a long, slow breath. "You're a strong woman, Maylin," he said softly. "Stronger than I had any right to hope for." He spurred his horse gently. "Come on, let's get you out of this saddle." As they rode down the slope toward the tiny, dark shack, Maylin squared her shoulders. This was her life now. She would sweep the dirt floor, she would patch the roof, she would cook the beans. She was Mei Lin, and she would survive. She did not see the strange, conflicted look Samuel cast toward the dark hills further north, where the true property line began, nor did she know that the test was not yet over. The interior of the line shack was exactly as Mei Lin had feared, yet she entered it with the reverence of a woman entering a temple. It was a single room, smelling of old pine resin, wood smoke, and the musty scent of neglect. A cast-iron stove sat in one corner, cold and gray with ash. A rough table with two mismatched chairs dominated the center, and in the back, a bed frame strung with rope held a mattress stuffed with straw. There were no curtains on the single, grime-streaked window. The floor was packed dirt, swept unevenly by the drafts that whistled through the chinking in the logs. Samuel stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the fading purple light, watching her. He held his hat in his hands, his knuckles white, waiting for the inevitable recoil. He waited for her to turn around and demand to be taken back to the town, to the broker, to civilization. But Mei Lin did not recoil. She set her small trunk down near the foot of the bed and turned to him, her face pale in the gloom but composed. "We need wood for the stove," she said, her voice steady, "and water. If we are to eat the beans you spoke of, we must start now." She began to unbutton the cuffs of her blue dress, rolling the sleeves up her slender arms. She looked around the room, not with judgment, but with an assessing eye. "I will need a broom, or branches if there is no broom." Samuel stared at her, his mouth slightly open. He had brought her to a hovel, a place he wouldn't house a prize horse in for more than a night, and she was asking for firewood. "There's a pile out back," he stammered, stepping into the room. "I'll get it, and the water." He moved quickly, grateful for a task, grateful to escape the intensity of her acceptance. He returned moments later with an armful of split cedar and a bucket of water from the creek. By then, Mei Lin had found a rag and was wiping down the table. The silence between them changed texture. It was no longer the silence of awkward strangers, but the tentative silence of co-workers. They moved around each other in the small space, the air warming as the stove roared to life. Samuel found the pot of beans, soaked but uncooked, and set them to boil. He added a chunk of salt pork from his supplies. It was a poor meal, a cowboy's meal, not fit for a wedding night. They ate by the light of a single kerosene lantern. The beans were tough, the broth thin. Mei Lin ate slowly, chewing carefully. "It is warm," she said, dipping a piece of hardtack into the broth. "That is enough." Samuel watched her across the table. The lantern light cast soft shadows on her face, hiding the fatigue he knew she must feel. She was beautiful, yes, with her dark hair and delicate features, but it was her spine that captivated him. She sat straight on the rickety chair, dining on poverty as if it were a feast. He felt a sharp pang of guilt in his chest, a physical ache that was almost unbearable. He wanted to tell her. The words sat on his tongue. "This isn't it. This isn't real." But fear held him back. He had to be sure. He had been fooled before by sweet words and feigned humility. He needed to know if she was staying for him or for what she thought he could give her. "Tomorrow," Samuel said, his voice rough, "I have to ride out early, check the herd. It's hard work. You can stay here, rest." Mei Lin looked up, her eyes dark and serious. "I am your wife, Samuel. If you work, I work. I cannot ride well yet, but I can learn, or I can cook. I can wash." She gestured to his shirt where the sleeve was fraying. "I can mend." "You don't have to," he said, almost whispering. "I want to," she replied. "We build this together. You said the land is quiet. We will fill it." Samuel looked down at his plate, blinking rapidly. He nodded, unable to speak. The test was not over, but the walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crack. The morning sun hit the canyon floor with a brutal intensity, stripping away the cool romance of the twilight. Maylin woke before Samuel. She rose from the straw mattress, her body aching in places she didn't know existed, and went to the stove. By the time Samuel sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes, she had coffee boiling, dregs he had in a tin, and the last of the biscuits warming in a skillet. She had even swept the dirt floor with a bundle of sagebrush she had tied together, creating a pattern of clean lines in the dust. The shack looked different. It looked cared for. It looked, in a terrifying way, like a home. Samuel ate the breakfast in silence, his eyes following her every movement. She hummed a low, mournful tune as she packed the saddlebags. She was preparing for another day of travel, assuming they would be riding the range of his poverty. She didn't ask for comforts. She didn't ask when they would go to town to buy furniture. She simply prepared to endure. He finished his coffee and stood up, putting his hat on with a decisive tug. He couldn't do it anymore. The charade had served its purpose, but carrying it further felt like cruelty. He looked at the woman who had slept on straw without a murmur of complaint, who had treated his line shack with the dignity of a manor. "Maylin," he said. She turned, holding the water canteen. "Leave the broom. Leave the pot." She looked confused, worry creasing her forehead. "But we need them for tonight." "We aren't coming back here tonight," Samuel said. He walked over to her, and for the first time he took her hand. His palm was rough, engulfing her small fingers. "I have to show you something. I have to take you to the rest of the property." "The rest?" she asked. "Is it far?" "A few hours," he said. "Over the ridge. The land, it changes over there." He looked into her eyes, searching for the right words. "You passed the night here, Maylin. You made this place a home in 1 hour. I needed to see that." "See what?" she whispered. "That you weren't looking for an easy life," he said. "That you were looking for a life with me." She squeezed his hand back, her grip surprisingly strong. "I told you, Samuel. I am here." "Come on," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's get Bess. You won't need to pack the straw." They rode out, leaving the shack behind in the dust. Samuel set a different pace today. He didn't ride with the slumped shoulders of a defeated man. He sat tall, his eyes scanning the horizon with pride rather than weariness. He led her away from the rocky, barren canyon and up a winding game trail that cut through a dense thicket of scrub oak. The terrain began to shift. The red dust gave way to darker soil. Patches of green grass appeared, sparse at first, then thickening into lush carpets that covered the hillsides. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. Maylin held on to the saddle horn, her confidence on the horse growing slightly, though she was distracted by the changing world around her. They passed a fence line, not a broken, drifting barrier, but a sturdy, 3-rail fence made of treated timber, stretching as far as the eye could see. The wire was tight, the posts straight. This cost money, a lot of money. She looked at Samuel's back. He wasn't looking at the fence. He was looking ahead, a tension in his posture that she couldn't interpret. Was he the caretaker of this land? Did he work for a wealthy baron he hadn't told her about? The thought made sense. He was a hand, maybe a foreman, living in the shack on the edge of the master's property. She prepared herself to meet the owner, to be the wife of the hired help. It was an honorable life. She would wash the master's clothes if need be. "We're crossing the cut," Samuel called back to her. "Just a little further. Close your eyes for a second, Maylin." "Close them?" she called back, confused. "Trust me," he said. "Just for a minute, until we crest this hill." She hesitated, then closed her eyes. She felt the mare laboring up the steep incline, the muscles bunching beneath the saddle. She heard the wind pick up, whistling through tall grass. She heard the call of a hawk, high and lonely. And then she heard the sound of water. Not a trickle, but the rushing, heavy sound of a river. "Okay," Samuel's voice was right beside her now. He had stopped his horse. "Open them." Maylin opened her eyes, and the breath left her body in a sharp gasp. They were standing at the top of a high ridge. Below them lay a valley that seemed to have been scooped out of heaven and placed on earth. It was a bowl of vibrant emerald green, fed by a wide, glittering river that snaked through the center. But it was not the nature that made her freeze. It was what sat in the middle of it. It was not a shack. It was not a cabin. It was a sprawling ranch house of whitewashed timber and stone, 2 stories high, with a wraparound porch that could have hosted a town meeting. Smoke curled lazily from 3 separate stone chimneys. Around the main house were barns, massive red-painted structures that dwarfed the buildings in the town she had arrived in. There were corrals filled with horses, sleek and spirited, and beyond that, spotting the green valley floor like thousands of russet stones, were cattle. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. Fat, healthy cattle grazing on rich grass. Men on horseback, tiny dots from this distance, were moving a herd near the river. A wagon, a real carriage with polished wheels, sat near the front of the main house. It was an empire. It was a kingdom hidden in the fold of the mountains. Maylin stared, her mind unable to reconcile the man in the faded vest beside her with this vista of immense wealth. She turned to look at him, her neck stiff, her eyes wide with shock. She was frozen, her hands gripping the reins so hard her knuckles were yellow. She looked from the mansion to Samuel, then back to the mansion. "Who?" she whispered, her voice failing her. "Who lives there?" Samuel took off his hat, spinning the brim in his fingers. He looked at the house with a mixture of pride and anxiety. "I do," he said softly. "We do." The silence that followed was absolute. Maylin sat on the spotted mare, her world tilting on its axis. The poverty she had prepared for, the starvation she had steeled herself against, the life of mending rags and sweeping dirt, it was all gone, snatched away in a heartbeat. In its place was something terrifyingly vast. This man was not a poor struggler. He was a king of the territory. "You," she started, then stopped. She felt a flush of heat, not of greed, but of confusion. "You own this? All of this?" "Every acre," Samuel said. "From this ridge to the mountains in the north. The Silver Creek Ranch." "But the shack," she pointed back the way they had come, her hand trembling. "The beans, the hole in your shirt." "I had to know," Samuel said, turning his horse to face her fully. His gray eyes were pleading now. "Maylin, you have to understand. Out here, when a man has this much, he never knows. He never knows if a woman wants him or if she just wants the soft life, if she wants the carriage and the silk dresses." He looked down at his rough hands. "I'm not a talker. I'm not a gentleman from the city. I'm just a rancher who got lucky with land and worked hard. I wanted a wife who would stand by me if the cattle died, if the river dried up, if the fire came." He reached out, tentatively touching her arm. She was still rigid, still in shock. "I needed to know if you could love a poor man," he whispered. "Because if you can love a poor man, you can survive anything. And you didn't just survive it. You treated that shack like a palace." Maylin looked at the grand house below, then back at Samuel. She saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that she would be angry, that she would feel tricked. And she was, a little. But beneath the trick was a profound vulnerability. He was a lonely man on a throne, terrified that his throne was the only thing people saw. "You lied," she said, but her voice was soft. I withheld the truth, he corrected gently. But the man you met yesterday, the man who respects you, that wasn't a lie. That was me. She looked at him, really looked at him. The dust on his face, the kindness he had shown the horse, the way he had slept on the floor so she could have the bed. He was the same man. He just came with a different burden. I expected poverty, she said, a slow, small smile touching her lips as the shock began to melt into a warm, overwhelming relief. I was ready to eat beans for the rest of my life. Samuel let out a laugh, a sound of pure release that echoed off the canyon walls. No more beans, he promised. I have a cook. Her name is Martha. She makes a roast that falls apart if you look at it too hard. A cook, Maylin repeated, testing the word. And the carriage? Yours, he said. We can take it to town tomorrow. Buy you a dress that isn't blue. Buy you 10 dresses. Maylin shook her head slowly. She reached out and took his hand again. 1 dress is enough, she said. But perhaps a softer bed? Samuel beamed, his face lighting up like the sunrise. The softest in the territory. He turned his horse toward the valley floor. Come on, Mrs. Samuel. Let's go home. For real this time. As they rode down the grassy slope toward the white house, the herds of cattle lowing in the distance, Maylin didn't look at the grand estate. She watched her husband, the shy rancher who had nothing, and yet had everything. She had come to save him from poverty, but he had saved her from it. And in the silence between them, there was no more testing, no more secrets, only the open, hopeful horizon of a life she never dared to dream.